subject today is all about surveys. Everybody thinks they might have a good idea, all their friends think they have a good idea, but how do you really know you have a good idea? So before you really put all that time, effort, and a lot of times money into pursuing your idea, it's really good to validate. We talk to TIA all the time about validate, validate, validate. And one of the best ways of doing that is through surveys. And we just happen to have on staff somebody, Dan works at in communications, and in a previous life he worked 5 years for Zombie International, which I'm sure you guys all know is around surveys. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
Sure. Hello. I'll start out just by prefacing this entire presentation with the fact that I'm definitely not a statistician. So if you have really in-depth statistical questions for me, I will probably direct you to a math teacher or someone who can answer that. My background, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. As Mary said, I used to work at Zogby International, a market research firm in Utica. Before that, I was a reporter for about 6 years. Worked at a small afternoon newspaper in Gloversville, and then for about 5 years in Schenectady at the Daily Gazette, doing municipal reporting. I worked in the Amsterdam City Beat, so I covered everything from fires to education. And part of that, I dealt with a lot of data for various stories. But I ended up getting hired at Zogby, not for my statistical skills, but for analysis. So basically being able to take a look at data and then present it in an unbiased way. So to talk about it without any slant, so the people that were getting the data back could look at it and get actionable results, right? Because you don't want to have data, you get a whole pile of data back, you just spent a lot of money on it, and then either you misread it or you misrepresent it, and that's the last thing that you want to do with it. So this is actually the last time I spoke in public about market research. It was in 2012 at Clinton High School. And at the time I had a little bit longer hair, and actually I dug out some of my old evaluation forms. I spoke to about 100 students, and I'll give you a little primer here for what some of the feedback. I pulled out my favorite ones. He didn't need the PowerPoint. He presented well enough that the information on the screen didn't add to the presentation. Also, his facial hair was amazing and well groomed. That was good. This is good here. Let's see. Their panels are annoying, and their surveys have pop-ups. They didn't like the surveys that we did, apparently. And he looked like Johnny Depp. He should grow out the beard. And then, so I'm getting kind of excited as I'm going through these at this point. I thought overall it was a great presentation. You could definitely be Johnny Depp's double. And lastly, you could be Johnny Depp's stunt double. Think about it. And she actually crossed out my name and wrote Johnny Depp. So hopefully I do a little better with my presentation this time. Clearly, didn't take away too much, but I want to start out, what better way to start out than start out with a question, right? So I'd like to survey the room. Do you need to conduct market research about your venture and your market? So for all the yeses, can you raise your hand? That's a lot of people, that's good. Can all the no's raise their hand? Nobody? Come on, nobody? All right, good. So that's easy to calculate in my head, 100% say yes, right? So you're not wrong if you said yes to the question, right? You're also not wrong if you said no, but since no one said no, we don't have to worry about that. This guy is wrong. I don't know if you ever saw this guy. No. And the question's wrong. So before you can take on a new survey or to do a survey about your venture, you want to make sure you're doing it right. Oh, and you don't want to be sad. That's my daughter. And that's how sad you'll be if you just spent a bunch of money on market research that you can't use. So I just want to talk a little bit about the question itself. And first off, this is what we'd call a double barrel question. So you're asking two things in one question here. And it's so easy to do that you can do it without even realizing it, right? So a venture and target market, they're two different things, right? So whatever the results are for this, they're useless because you don't know if the person's talking about one or the other or both together. It's not helpful. Or it might be nuanced, right? So what if you're just asking about the venture, but maybe the answer is not now, maybe it's in the future. But what if you don't know, right? So if you're answering this question and you don't know if you need to do market research about your venture and you're forced to answer yes or no, your data is also invalid, right? Because you're forcing someone to put their check mark in a bucket that doesn't apply because they actually don't know the answer. So it's better to have an option that says, I don't know, and to have your yes and no total up to like less than 100%, because it's real data. It's something that you know is true. Also, feel free to ask me any questions. There's not a lot of people here, so if anything doesn't make sense, just yell. So you can think about different ways to do it. So yes and no is nice, right? But you don't get any granularity in the results. So there's no shades of gray. So there might be something where you can do an agreement scale. Do you strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree, and not sure. And the nice part about this is you can get your yes and no by totaling your agrees, totaling your disagrees. It just gives you more ways to look at a question. This question's probably not the best example for it since it's a pretty straightforward question, but for things where there's a lot more to it, you're going to take away more for your, the time that you spent putting that question together than if you just asked a yes or no question. So part of designing a good survey for your venture or for whatever you're doing, you have to decide what you're doing the survey for. It's hard to do everything all at once, and you can break it apart in the survey itself, but there's different things, like is the concept good? Is your idea good? If you want to just test that, you can do that through market research, of course. But maybe you have an idea, and you know that's the idea that you're going to use, and you're going to move forward with it. Maybe you want to test how you're messaging that product, right? Maybe you want to talk about how the best way to describe your amazing widget that's going to change the world. Like, what does the public think about it? Maybe you're looking for feedback about, some component of your venture. Or maybe you're looking for your target market. Maybe you don't know if your venture is best for college students or for senior citizens, or if you're looking for a geographic analysis. So maybe you're looking for, maybe your product's going to work better in the South or in the North or in a certain state. Or if you're doing, if you're doing a rollout small in a region, right? You want to find out regionally whether or not your venture is going to work. And there's different ways that can be done. There are actually companies that will do surveys based on zip codes. You can do it based on school districts. You can do it based on voting districts. There's a lot of different ways that the sample can be broken down depending on what you're looking to achieve. So you need to know all of those things before you even start your survey, because who you ask has a big impact, obviously, on what you get. And lastly, media attention. So you might be conducting this survey just for press, right? So when I worked at Zogby, there were companies all the time, or maybe lobby groups that wanted to do surveys so they could get some fodder, so they could go to the press and say, 90% of the people say they don't want to ban, large sodas in New York City, something like that. So I'm going to go through just a little bit of market research lingo, and you guys may or may know all of this already, but just as a primer, if you are looking to do some research, so you kind of know a little bit about what people are talking about if you do contact a company to do it, or if you're doing it on your own, it's good to know some of the basics. So sample obviously is the group that you're surveying, and what you do is you think about the population as a whole, and you want a representative group of that population. So for instance, if you were surveying, if you wanted to survey Hamilton, New York, right? To get a representative sample of Hamilton, you need to have something that mirrors the population. The respondents taking the survey have to kind of look like Hamilton, New York. And the way that's done with most research companies is they'll go and use census data. And that's important to note, because as you get further away from the last census, actually the data suffers a little bit. And actually in 2008 for the election, the presidential election, you're 8 years away from the last census. So a lot of the polling companies had a difficult time putting their samples together because things change a lot during that time. So another thing that's important is a methodology and the margin of error. All good surveys should have a methodological statement. And this is actually a real one that I did from, I think this is from 2009. And this was a public interest nonprofit. And they surveyed folks in New York State. It was adults. This was on the telephone. The samples were drawn, they're called telephone CDs, but nationally listed samples, basically voter registration and a few other ways that the samples are drawn. And then kind of how that's done. So how many calls they made and how they construct that sample, how they construct the group of people that you're reaching out to is all kind of dictated by this national organization for research. They kind of have all of these people with PhDs that figure out the best way to take a sample from a population. And then after that, they weight by region, education, age, religion, and it depends on the survey, and then this one had a margin of error of 3.3 up or down. So margin of error is important to know. So the bigger your sample is, the more people that you're surveying, the lower your margin of error, right? If you're surveying thousands of people, your margin of error is going to be a lot lower than it would be if you're surveying 100 people. And that's really important because when you're talking about the results, when you get them back, you want to make sure that you're only talking about results that are outside the margin of error, right? So you want to make sure that if the difference in this survey, for instance, was 3.3%, it has to be well above that in order for you to flag a significant difference between the answers. So weighting. So weighting is the process for when you have your sample together, right? So you've got your group of people in Hamilton, New York, right? And you realize that it's not really representative of the population. And the number of people that responded, for instance, not enough women responded, okay? So the sample itself will actually be weighted to reflect the population. So for instance, one woman's response might be weighted as 1.3 women. So when the data is run in the end, it makes sense because that's based off of the actual population. It's something you don't get with like SurveyMonkey or any of the online surveys that aren't run by a company that basically is doing these kind of statistical analysis. And that's all done by people with PhDs and do these giant algorithms that are pages long. Frequency is just, so this picture has nothing to actually do with the frequency. I Googled frequency, and that's what came up. It's radio frequency probably, but frequency is your overall responses. So when you do your survey and you get your data back, and you have your question and you have your percentages for those things, not broken down by anything else, those are the frequency of response. It's the total response for each category. Demographics. So you want to know who you're polling. So for instance, part of it's my family and some friends. Pokemon fans, all right? So you want to know what demographics matter for your venture, right? Do you need to talk to students? Do you need to talk to someone who has purchased something before, right? So depends on your audience and what you're doing. And the reason you want those demographics and you want to ask those questions up front, like did you graduate college, level of education, age, income, you name it. It can be basically any demographic question you can come up with that you think might be valuable to your research. The reason that's important is because you're going to get these things back called crosstabs. And this is so you can see your question, and this is one I just took off the internet, was a Coca-Cola crosstab, and it was about frequency of consuming Coke. So you can see when you get crosstabs back, 327 people took this survey. That's the 100%. That's everybody who did it. It's kind of crazy. What is it? Every day. 11% drink Coke every day. Now, I don't know the sample here. They could just be surveying people who have drank Coke before, so you wouldn't even know. I don't think that this is adults nationwide, but you never know. But up on top, you see they've broken it down by age and gender. So that's the two banners in the crosstab that they're looking at. So you can kind of get a little bit more granularity in the responses. And then you can see, sometimes when you're looking through data like this, depending on how many demographic buckets you have in the banners, you can find something surprising about your data. So you can find out that women are really more likely to like your product, right? Or maybe someone living in the Southwest. A lot of times we would break it out by region when we did surveys. So, but all of that, you can't do any of that if you don't have those demographic questions. If you're going to go to a company to buy a survey, you want to make sure you ask ahead of time what demographic information they have. And actually, SurveyMonkey, you can actually buy samples based on what you can buy demographic samples. I don't know all of their buckets. They have a number of different ones. But there might be something that's helpful for you. Coding. So coding. If you do a survey on your own, okay, and you ask a lot of open questions, all right? So the questions allow the respondent to say whatever they want. There is a window. You can do this on SurveyMonkey. You can do this on Facebook. You can do this with a lot of the, even if you hired a firm. People can write whatever they want, right? And if you're surveying hundreds of people, you get back hundreds of responses. And usually that's not very helpful. You have this like windfall of just bleh. Somebody's got to go through all of that. And you have to remember that to try and, if you don't want to go through everything, try and narrow it down and not give so many options for people to just say whatever they want. But if you do feel like you need that, if you need that kind of input, the responses can be coded and they can be turned into percentages by basically making categories. And you set up like an Excel file and you go through as you're reading things and you're basically picking out the gist of the statement. Doesn't like this, So you're taking someone's like 3 or 4 sentence diatribe about your product or your venture and boiling it down into its essence. And then you're putting that as basically a slash, right, into a bucket. And then at the end, you can add up all of your, you make up buckets as you go. As you read things, people will surprise you. Doesn't like the color purple, so sometimes you need to make special buckets for things. And then you can look at the data like that. It's an easier way to digest it. It's not very exciting. Sometimes it's fun, depending on the question. But so some examples of bad data. You want to make sure whatever you do, you have a methodological statement, because if you don't have something that says how you did the survey, your data is really going to be useless in the public arena. If you're using that to get investors to give money to your project, they're going to want to know that it was done appropriately and that it was done with a little bit of science behind it. They want to know, part of that methodological statement is going to say what the sample was comprised of. How did you come to the people that you asked questions to? It's why Facebook samples no good, because what is the sample for Facebook? It's pretty much anybody who's using Facebook, right? So your sample is a computer user who also uses Facebook. You're narrowing down the total number of responses basically by just use of Facebook. Same thing with biased questions. So you don't want to ask anything in a leading way. You don't want to ask double-barreled questions. And then misrepresenting the results. So there are plenty of places you'll see probably memes going around about the election that misrepresent polling data. And that's very easy to do until you see all the back end. Once you see those numbers, you want to look at how the data was collected. Good data, obviously. Opposite. Appropriate sample. Good methodology, unbiased questions, and then being honest about the results, and not just cherry picking results either. It's standard practice for anyone, if you're going to try and get press out of your results, you have to release the whole survey. And the reason that is that if the press is going to write about what you've done, they want to see what else you've asked, because sometimes a question asked before the next question can influence that response. So you can ask a whole bunch of leading, really mean questions or something really slandering a political candidate, for instance, and then you have one kind of normal question, and then if you just release that question, it's worthless, because the question's been tainted by everything that's been done before it. So one of the stories I always like to tell about skeptics with polling, a lot of people say, oh, I wasn't polled, so how do you know what I'm thinking? Or you didn't ask everyone. One time I gave one of these presentations. It was about data that was collected for the New York State Small Business Association. And I was in Albany, and we had surveyed 100 small business owners, which is a pretty good sample of small businesses in New York State. There's quite a few small businesses, right? But 100 is pretty good out of that. It's also, the list was generated from the Small Business Association. So it was members of the Small Business Association. We knew that these people were actually small business owners. And one guy harumphed and told me, he's like, how can you know? You only asked 100 people. So, I asked him if the last time he had his blood taken, did they take all of it? Because we don't need it all. We don't need all your blood. If you have a scientifically sound sample, you can easily explain why the data is valid. And that's important. So how do you get actionable, valid data, right? So there's lots of different ways that you can do that. Some more expensive than others. Some considered more valid than others. And it's funny because the old mainstay of the telephone survey is not quite as valid as it used to be, just because of the proliferation of cell phones. Obviously, who has a landline these days? Almost you kind of get a weird sample if you're just surveying landlines, because that's not the majority of the population. So a lot more companies that do telephone surveys are now supplementing with cell phones. I think Gallup does something like 45% or along those lines. They do a huge number, but it's difficult because certain states don't allow you to do cell phone, like you can't call cells unsolicited in a bunch of states. So you can actually break the law without even knowing it. And that's important to know because there's some do-it-yourself online surveys. I'll get through this first. Okay, so they're trusted. You have a call center. These telephone surveys, the media love, like they're considered the most reliable. And you have the option of getting on an omnibus. And so if you only have 1 or 2 questions you're looking to do, you might be able to jump onto a telephone survey where a bunch of different people are on it, right? So some companies will do these omnibus surveys and they'll get like 30 different clients, so you can only pay a very small fraction of what it would normally cost for the survey. The cons is even doing an omnibus telephone survey can still be expensive. There's professional online surveys, not America Online anymore, but they're much less expensive than phones. You go through, most of the companies that do them also do other types of polling. They're fast, they're reliable. The media is starting to accept them more, but there's always been concerns about access. So it has to be someone with a computer, someone with access to a computer. So it kind of limits. In the demographics that you get back, you see that there are fewer people from lower socioeconomic buckets because they don't have the access to computers. Also, the access to the internet. So rural populations, you find that there's not enough people from rural areas responding. So it's important to think about that ahead of time. I mean, if you're doing a survey of just New York City, doing an online survey is probably pretty sound. So it really depends on what you're trying to find out. So then there's do-it-yourself. These things, this is the SurveyMonkeys, the Facebooks. They're cheap. They're fairly hassle-free, flexible. A lot of them give you a lot of cool metrics, ways to kind of analyze the data. But there's no guidance, so nobody can help you with your survey. A lot of them are panel-driven, and what that means is that they're drawing their sample from a group of people that have been pre-selected. And a lot of it's like if you go on Facebook or if you go on basically anything that has clickbait, click here, and asks you to put your name in, you're pretty much guaranteed to be put in one of these lists that are being sold. And then these vendors basically sell these lists of names, and certain places like SurveyMonkey will curate this list, and you'll get a survey, and if you answer that one survey, you're now on their panel. You'll probably get invited to take other surveys. And statistically, they've been criticized a lot because you're drawing from a pre-selected group of people that are likely to answer surveys. So it's not quite as random. You're not drawing from a general population. There's a lot of fighting back and forth about whether or not that's okay. In general, depending on what you're doing, probably for your purposes, unless you're using your survey research to solicit money, you're probably fine with using a panel. I know that when they did a lot of testing when I was at Zogby about panel versus non-panel, the difference was only a few percentage points either way. So as long as you're not kind of staking everything on this one survey, it's not a bad way to go. In-person intercept. So if your project is very local, or if what you're working on is hyper local, say it has to do with like Colgate, or if it has to do with Hamilton, or it has to do with a very small community, sometimes intercept interviews are good. Basically someone with a clipboard and a questionnaire, and they're asking questions. The problem with it is that it's time consuming. All of that data that you collect has to manually be turned into percentages and everything. So you come back and you'll have a stack of sheets of answers, and each one of those has to be entered generally into Excel to turn into data. Also, people will hate you because no one wants to be accosted in the middle of the street and ask their opinion on stuff. Can be fun though. In-person focus groups. Focus groups are awesome for that qualitative feedback. If you don't need hard data, if you just need like people to respond to your idea, in-person focus groups can be great. And depending on your audience, you can probably organize it yourself even. You can offer people gift cards or something for coming. It doesn't take a lot to get people into a room, but you have to organize it, right? You've got to do all that work if you don't want a firm to do it for you. And you have to have someone take notes and put all that together and kind of distill it down into the main points that were learned. You can also have someone in a focus group fill out a little form ahead of time too. So you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. You can get that kind of in-person intercept interview done right before your focus group, and you can have them fill out a lot of their background information right away. And then obviously you have to key that in. Online focus groups. There's a number of companies that do online focus groups. They can be good. I feel like there's something kind of lost in translation when you get a bunch of people on little screens online. You lose that interaction, and part of the value of a focus group is you get a bunch of people in a room and they kind of start feeding off of each other and start responding to what one person says. That happens a little bit with the online focus groups, but you don't get it as much. The nice part about it is most of them will record it for you, so you'll have it all there. And you can get transcripts and things of it. But sometimes it's nice if you want to show an investor like the fervor of the people that you have in the focus group. They can see that right away, and sometimes you can stream them. So that's a nice option. So there's a lot of other ways that you could do market research, and a lot of these are more expensive, but there's like dial testing. So a lot of times if you have some type of commercial that you've put together, or if you have a video, a lot of times they'll do this with like movie trailers or something, and people will turn it, or if they're watching a political debate, people will turn a dial to like positive or negative. So in real time, while things are going on, sometimes you can see this. News networks will sometimes do it, and you can see kind of the general public opinion right at the moment that someone says something. So you can see like a spike in people like agreeing with something someone said, or a giant, downfall if someone really screwed up. But obviously online feedback forums, it can be as simple as having a place for people to go to give their opinion about what you've done. And then there's a lot of publicly available data. So depending on what you're trying to do, you might be able to find something. Almost all of the surveys the government does that's not classified, they're all publicly available. If you go to data.gov, there is just a ton of research that might be applicable to what you're doing. Reddit, our data sets is amazing, pretty amazing place to find information and publicly available data. You can also go on there if you're a Reddit user and request data, and someone might have it. It might not be super specific, but it might help a lot. And greenbook.org is like the Bible for market research. So if you're at a point with your venture where you feel like you want to hire a company to do some work, that's the place to go. And pretty much every market research firm in the world is there. So if you're trying to figure out where to go, all of the options will be there for you. So, and that is pretty much it. That's just all the picture stuff. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any. Maybe I can help specific questions about your venture. Like polling is so specialized depending on what you're looking to get out of it. So, I mean, yeah, sure.
How do you propose that we get an unbiased survey, since you said surveying with SurveyMonkey isn't that great, and then surveying on Facebook isn't that great?
Mm-hmm.
Even though I might have like 1,500 Facebook friends or something like that, that's a large sample.
It's a sample of your Facebook friends.
Yeah, so
right.
How do you propose someone trying to conduct research on campus go about?
Well, if it's on campus, I mean, do you need to know about people on campus? Because in that case, your Facebook survey is probably just fine because your friends are probably mostly from campus, right? Or thereabouts. Your audience, what audience you're looking to tap into really matters. If you're looking to extrapolate that to a bigger idea, right, that's more marketable nationwide, right, that's probably not the best way to do it.
Yeah.
So if you're looking to do something local, it makes total sense. Are you looking to do something bigger? Bigger. So with SurveyMonkey, you should be able to buy a sample of college students, right? So that'd be a good way to do it. Questions?
Could you talk a little bit about qualitative research? You talked about focus groups.
Mhm.
And I experienced once trying to do a focus group myself. And one of the things I found was it was hard to, I found that the people at the focus group seemed to be relating to me because they knew I had a stake in what I was asking them.
Mhm.
And I felt like they were giving me the answers I wanted to hear rather than the answers I needed to hear. So I wonder if you have any advice on, for folks who maybe can't afford to pay for a company to run focus group, like how can you run a better focus group?
Right. I mean, part of it is selecting people that aren't going to know you, right? So, maybe they don't even know your title or what you're doing. So maybe if you bring in the people blind, if you're doing it a little bit more random, you're inviting people that don't know what your angle is. That's usually the best way to go about it. If not, maybe enlisting the help of a friend. Maybe you're taking notes, and maybe someone who's not as connected to it is asking the questions. And generally, you can prime that person ahead of time with a list of things you want to learn, right? And then they can ask. They don't have to be intimately related with the project, so that can sometimes combat that. But it is hard. You know, that's why a lot of in-person focus groups, right, will have like the mirrored window and people sitting behind it because they don't want to influence what's going on. So.
One of the things that we talk about a lot, and I don't know if you want to kind of expound on it, is be careful when you are surveying that you're not just trying almost to validate what you already think.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of goes back to the past, but if you're just surveying your own Facebook friends,
Mm-hmm.
you're friends with them for a reason because they probably think like you do. So, like, how can they break out of that rut?
Right. Well, I think that's where the random sample really is important when you're asking questions. That it's not, your friends or someone who's in your class or someone who's heard a lot of the same things that you've heard, because the general population won't be like that. As far as asking questions that aren't biased, have other people look at the survey that you develop outside of your bubble, right? Have someone who's done a survey before take a look at it. Have people parents or somebody not as I guess without blinders, someone who's not kind of invested in your project either. Someone who you don't want someone who just wants your project to succeed and say, oh, this is the way to go. That can be hard too, finding the right people, but you just have to ask around.
Are there ways to pool resources? For instance, you have a couple different ventures, but you're going after the same market group.
Mm-hmm.
So that, would it be too random to combine a survey that would allow for two ventures to go in on?
No, I mean, so when I was at Zogbean, we're doing online surveys. We would do kind of a bi-weekly omnibus, and I mean, we would have clients on there, 40, 30 different clients at a time on one survey. So it'd be one question, about, drinking water in Texas, and another question about, widgets, something like that. I mean, it can really change. And as long as it's put together in such a way that there's not questions, you have to make sure that the questions aren't, that don't influence each other. So they have to be really kind of broad. So it depends on the ventures. You want to make sure that the ventures are kind of different too. So it's kind of like the person that's answering the questions doesn't start relating things and doesn't start influencing their responses. But I mean, it might be a good idea for people to pool their resources if they do have a small pool of money to try and buy that research together.
Can you buy random sample lists?
Yeah, so there are sample companies that's all they do is sell sample. Now, how you're going to use that, what platform you're going to use to sample or to ask questions of that group. You wouldn't be able to send out a mass email to all those people because part of the sample, using that sample, is that they're all anonymous, right? So it's one of the principles of that APOR group that I pointed out in the beginning that there's data protection, and you probably can't go and buy that sample without proving that you have those data protections in place to ensure that those people aren't exposed. Otherwise, you could just take all of that and give it away.
Well, it's not for that.
Hmm?
When you use SurveyMonkey.
Right. Yeah, SurveyMonkey, they sell, like I say, all those different groups, but it's from their panel too. So I think it's still helpful. It's just nice to know the limitations of it. You know, if you're trying to use that data for investors, it's probably not going to go very far. And if you're trying to use that data for media exposure, it's not going to go very far either.
So what would you recommend?
For if you did want media exposure, if you did want
For the best survey.
the best survey. So
The media.
there really isn't one best survey to fit all, right? I even think telephone is kind of terribly flawed these days. I do think online surveys with a random sample is really the best way to go. And sometimes you can supplement that. I've seen hybrid of telephone and online, but that gets really pricey. So I do think that, Gallup's daily tracking is done online. Well, they actually do both. They do online and phones. So they actually have that resources to do something like that. But I think it's perfectly reasonable. There's white papers about online survey research with panels that says it's good, and it's really the media that's kind of lagging behind in accepting it. And I think they're just kind of waiting for more and more of this research behind it to say that they're okay with it.
I took a survey class a long time ago, and it seems to me that there's a certain number of surveys you have to do in order for the data to be statistically significant.
Mhm.
Do you know how many that would be? Like, are we talking about 300 surveys?
Well, it depends on what you're saying. It depends on how you're branding the survey. So if you're saying a survey of adults nationwide, you need a different number than you do of likely voters.
How about surveys of parents and grandparents?
Right, so you need a smaller number of that because the number of parents is less than adults nationwide. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but someone who puts together those samples could probably rattle it off. I know that nationwide, if you surveyed 1,000 adults nationwide, your margin of error is like 3.3%. It's pretty good.
Can you talk a little bit more about analyzing your results once you get them?
Mhm.
So you showed your crosstabs, an example of crosstabs, and analyzing the results is an art in and of itself. And sometimes if you're too close to your own data, you might not even know the opportunities of things you could compare
Mhm.
to draw even deeper conclusions. Are there people out there that can help you do that part?
Yeah, any of those companies that you find on the grade book, you'll find people that do analysis of the data. They're only going to want to analyze their own data, so you're not going to be able to bring your data to them. They're only going to want to do it if they collected it, because then they know that it's sound and they know that what went behind it to get to that point. I think it's important to, when you do look at the data, you want to look for those really big differences, and that's what's most important, especially with like online surveys or any survey methodology like SurveyMonkey or there's actually a company called Boomerang that you can do telephone call surveys with an online system. So you could actually go and record your questions, and it'll do a telephone survey with those questions automated. It's a cheaper way to do a telephone survey if you wanted to go that way. But to hedge against any concern about analysis of the data and kind of cutting things too close, you want to look at big differences. You want to look things that are double or triple the margin of error. So even if the margin of error is off a little bit, you're covered, you're okay, because it's such a big difference. There are times where you do a survey and you don't get the results that you kind of wish you were getting, those clear, actionable answers, because the data is just not strong enough. So it happens.
Students have access to Qualtrics, and what do you think about that?
I have not played a lot with Qualtrics, so
Do they have access to it?
I don't know. Do you know, Rebecca?
Yes, they do.
Do they?
Oh, okay.
Cool.
That gives me interest.
Thank you.
So Qualtrics is an online survey, similar to a SurveyMonkey, but it's through Colgate.
Yep. I have not played
You
with
can
it.
sign up for an account on the ITS webpage if you're interested, and there's some really good tutorials on the Qualtrics site. It's really good stuff.
Nice.
TRICS.
Well, thank you all. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you for
If you have questions about your specific ventures, or if there's anything that you think I might be able to help with, I'm always happy to answer questions too, or maybe kind of guide you in a certain direction or something. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.